At the billionaire's birthday party, the fiancé humiliated the maid's gift. Moments later, the envelope changed everything. Vivienne Ashford had her hand around the sign before Ruth said anything. It was a small thing, barely 12 inches wide, hand-lettered in blue paint on a piece of pine that had been sanded but not stained, the kind of careful, unhurried work that looked simple until you looked closely enough to see how much time it had taken. The letters were even. The paint had not bled. Whoever had made it with the particular patience of someone who understood that a thing done for a front window deserved to be done correctly, even if no one was going to frame it. Every stitch is a promise. The shop itself was smaller than Vivienne had remembered it being, or perhaps she had last been here young enough that its dimensions had seemed larger in proportion to her own. It occupied the ground floor of a building that had been, when her mother took the lease, a hardware storefront, and that had been converted through the specific patience of a woman who did everything slowly and correctly into something that looked, 30 years later, like it had always been exactly what it was. The workroom in the back with its 2 machines, the pressing station, the long mirror along the wall for fittings, and the counter at the front with the small display of thread and notions arranged by color in a way that was clearly her mother's doing, the same instinct for order that had organized their home growing up, and that Vivienne had apparently inherited through some mechanism she had never stopped to examine. She had driven 4 hours to get here, stopping once for gas, and once because her eyes were tired, the way they got tired when she had been holding herself very still for too long. Her mother had died 3 weeks earlier. She had come for the funeral and left the same day, which was a thing she had told herself was necessary and that she now understood, standing in the shop with the estate assessor arriving on Thursday, had been a choice she made because she did not know what to do with the amount of time a proper stay would have required her to spend inside feelings she had not yet finished having. Vivienne had found it behind the counter, where it had apparently lived in a bracket on the interior wall for as long as Ruth could remember, before her mother had moved it there from the window sometime in the last year. She had picked it up with the automatic efficiency of a woman sorting a space that needed to be sorted. Estate sale assessor arriving Thursday. Lease ending the 1st of the month, 30 years of her mother's life to be compressed into keep or discard in approximately 4 days. And she had already mentally filed it under discard, the way she had mentally filed the spools of thread organized by color along the far wall. The way she had mentally filed the basket of buttons sorted by size that her mother had apparently been adding to for as long as the shop had been open. The way she had mentally filed most of the things in this room that were clearly beloved and were beloved in a language she had never learned to speak. "Wait," Ruth said. Vivienne looked up. Ruth had been in the back room since Vivienne arrived, moving through the space the way she moved through everything, with the practiced, unhurried competence of someone who had worked in this shop for 22 years and knew where every pin was and why it was there. She was 68 and had a particular stillness that Vivienne recognized, with a jolt she did not entirely expect, as the same stillness her mother had carried. The stillness of people who had learned, through repetition, that most things could wait for the time they actually deserved. "I know what pile that's going into," Ruth said. "I'd ask you to read something first." Vivienne set the sign down, the way you set something down when someone has asked you to rather than because you intended to. "What's something?" Ruth came around the counter and reached beneath it, to a low shelf Vivienne hadn't looked at yet, and brought out a box, a proper wooden box, the kind with a fitted lid and dovetail joints, built to last, sitting in the particular way objects sit when they have been in the same place for a very long time, and have become, through the accumulation of that time, somewhat more than a container. Ruth placed it on the counter and lifted the lid without flourish, and did not look at Vivienne while she did it. The way people don't look at a person they're handing something important to, because the looking would be too much pressure on what is already enough. "Your mother kept this for 30 years, Ruth said. "She didn't call it anything, she just added to it, and kept the lid on, and never asked anyone to look at it while she was alive. I don't think she expected anyone to after either." She stepped back from the counter. "But I've been watching you go through this shop for an hour and a half, and I think you need to look at it before you make any more decisions about what's worth keeping in here." Vivienne looked at the box, then at Ruth, then at the sign, still lying on the counter with its letters facing up. "How long have you worked here?" she asked, because it was the question her mind reached for when it needed a moment. 22 years, Ruth said. "I was hired 3 months after your mother opened the second workroom. You were in college. We never overlapped much." This was true. Vivienne had visited the shop 17 times in 30 years, which was a number she had not calculated until this week, when the estate lawyer had asked if she needed time to go through the property, and she had said no, 4 days should be plenty, and then stood in the doorway on the first morning, and understood that she had no idea what any of it was. "All right," Vivienne said, and sat down on the stool behind the counter, which her mother had apparently sat on every day for 3 decades, and which was worn, at the edge, to the exact contour of someone who sat very straight and leaned forward slightly over her work. "Show me." The first thing Ruth took from the box was an envelope. Not the kind of thing that gets opened at a party, nothing dramatic about it, just a plain white business envelope with a name written on the outside in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a card, the kind sold in drugstores, and inside the card was a note written in 2 different hands, the first adult and the second a child's careful printing, and tucked behind the note was a small gold pin, a 4-leaf clover, the paint on one leaf slightly worn. Vivienne read the note. She read it twice. She looked at the pin. "Who is Adela Torres?" she asked. "She came in 6 months after she lost her husband," Ruth said. "She needed his suit altered to fit her son for the funeral. They couldn't. The money was very tight. Your mother altered the suit, and cleaned and pressed it, and didn't charge her. The card came back 2 weeks later. The pin was her husband's, from his first job. She said she wanted someone who did good work to have it." Ruth paused. "Your mother kept it in the box instead of wearing it. She said it belonged to the whole story, not just to her." Vivienne set the card and the pin carefully aside. Ruth reached into the box again. The second thing was a photograph, small and square in the way photographs were small and square when they were printed from the machines at pharmacies in the 90s. A child, maybe 8, in a school uniform, blazer, white shirt, dark trousers, standing in front of a school entrance with the slightly formal posture of a child who has been told to stand up straight for a photograph and is doing so with considerable effort. The uniform fit. It fit the way clothes fit when they have been properly altered rather than worn as is and grown into. On the back, in handwriting Vivienne recognized, "Robbie, September 1997. Let out 3 times this year, starting 4th grade." His mother brought him every fall, Ruth said, for 8 years. She was a home health aide, 2 kids. The uniform was second-hand when she bought it, and it was already small. Your mother altered it every September and refused to charge her. Robbie went to university on a scholarship. He sent a letter when he graduated. Ruth reached into the box and found the letter, unfolded it, placed it beside the photograph. "He's a structural engineer now. He named his firm after his mother." Vivienne looked at the photograph for a long time. The boy in the photograph was 8 years old and stood very straight and did not yet know the particular weight of the word scholarship or what it would mean for the shape of his life. He was simply standing in front of a school entrance in a uniform that fit. "My mother never told me about any of this," Vivienne said. "No," Ruth agreed. "She didn't." "Why not?" Ruth considered the question with the unhurried care she apparently brought to most things. "I think she felt the stories belonged to the people in them," she said. "Not to her. She wasn't collecting them to have something to show anyone. She was just keeping them. The way you keep things you love." Vivienne looked at the box. It was not a large box, perhaps 12 inches on a side and 8 inches deep, but it was full. Not crammed, but full in the deliberate way of something whose contents have been arranged rather than accumulated, each item placed with the awareness that something else would eventually need room beside it. "How many things are in there?" she asked. Ruth looked at the box. "I've never counted," she said. "A lot." Vivienne stayed in the shop until 7 that evening. She had planned to be at her hotel by 4. She went through the box the way Ruth offered it, not all at once, but item by item, each one presented with the context Ruth could provide from 22 years of watching Petra Ashford's work, and the occasional glimpse into the stories that had walked through the door attached to a garment that needed mending. Some of the items Ruth explained, others she couldn't. There were things in the box that predated her, notes in languages neither of them spoke, objects whose origin she could only guess at. These, Ruth had learned, were the ones Vivienne's mother had accepted without full understanding, placing them in the box alongside everything else, because she had apparently believed that a person offering a token in gratitude for something that mattered to them deserved to have the offering received, whether or not the receiver had all the context. Ruth was not, herself, an expansive person. She did not narrate the box's contents the way a person narrates a tour. She retrieved items, provided context where she had it, and then sat back in the particular way she had of giving a room its own time. The habit, Vivienne slowly understood, of someone who had learned from 22 years beside Petra that most things landed better when they were allowed to land at their own pace, rather than being caught and interpreted by someone standing right there. It made her, Vivienne thought on the second afternoon, an extraordinarily difficult person to be sat in front of, in the specific way that some people's steadiness makes your own unsteadiness feel less like a crisis and more like the ordinary human weather it actually is. She was grateful for it in a way she didn't try to articulate because she suspected Ruth would find the articulation unnecessary. Between items, they sometimes talked. Not about her mother directly, neither of them knew yet quite how to do that, but around her, the way you talk around something you are approaching carefully, mapping its edges before you commit to walking into the center of it. Ruth told her about the workroom, about the particular problem of maintaining a working steam press at the level of reliability a professional shop required. Vivienne talked about a project she had been in the middle of when the call came. A dining room in a house whose owner wanted the space to feel both formal and livable, a combination that was technically achievable and practically difficult, like most combinations worth attempting. They found, in these conversations, that they were both people who cared about the difference between something done correctly and something done merely adequately, and that this shared orientation gave them, across a significant gap in circumstance and background, enough common ground to keep talking. The wedding veil was in the middle of the box. It was in a small, clear bag, not the kind wedding shops use, just a freezer bag, sealed, with a piece of card inside that read, Isabel and Tom, March 2003. Ripped the morning of the wedding. Done in 1 hour. We almost didn't make it. I remember that one, Ruth said. She called at 7:30 in the morning. Your mother lived above the shop back then. She came downstairs in her housecoat, didn't even put on shoes, and sat at the machine for 55 minutes straight. They drove her to the ceremony. She paused. They came back afterward with a piece of wedding cake. Your mother put it in the box. The piece of cake was not, obviously, still there. But the little card the couple had written was, and the fragment of lace that had been trimmed from the repair was folded alongside it, and there was something about the physical evidence of an emergency solved in 55 minutes in a housecoat with no shoes that landed in Vivienne's chest with a weight she had not braced for. She had built a career on beautiful things. She was good at it, genuinely. She had an eye for what worked and why. A sense of proportion and color and how a space could be made to feel larger or smaller or more or less like itself through the considered placement of objects within it. She had clients who had waited 3 years for an opening in her calendar. She had been photographed in her own living room for a design magazine the previous spring. She had spent a very long time, she understood clearly now, in a room full of evidence of her own taste. Her mother had spent a very long time in a room full of evidence of other people's need. Vivienne was 44 years old, and she was sitting on her mother's stool in her mother's shop, holding a freezer bag containing a fragment of wedding lace from 2003, and understanding for the first time, in a way that no previous understanding of the same approximate truth had managed to make real, that she had been measuring her mother's life against the wrong scale for approximately 20 years, and had never noticed because nobody had shown her the actual measurement. She had not been unkind to her mother. That was the part she kept returning to, because it would have been easier if she had been unkind. If there was a clear wrong she could identify and name. She had not been unkind. She had visited 17 times in 30 years. She had sent gifts at Christmas and called on birthdays, a call that lasted on average 18 minutes, which she knew was an average because she had a habit of noting the duration of calls in the small log she kept for billing purposes, and she had noticed, years ago, that her mother's calls clustered tightly around that duration, and she had not asked herself at the time why that was, but she was asking herself now, because she had kept them that long. She had not let them run over because she was a busy woman who had things to do, and she had not let them fall shorter because her mother was her mother. And 18 minutes was a respectable amount of time to spend on the phone with a parent who ran a small alteration shop and whose daily life did not intersect in any obvious way with Vivienne's own. The distance had not been sudden. It had not been the result of a fight or a betrayal or any of the clear moments that mark a relationship going wrong in a way the participants can point to later. It had been gradual, the way most distances are gradual. A series of small, apparently reasonable decisions that accumulated, over 20 years, into something permanent without anyone calling it that. Vivienne had left for university and found a world that moved at a speed her mother's life did not move at, and she had chosen, in ways she had never quite articulated to herself, to live inside that speed. She had chosen friends who worked in design and architecture and media, chosen a husband who ran a successful firm, chosen apartments in cities that valued the kind of work she did, and she had kept the shop in the part of her life that she called home but visited less often than most people visited places they call home. She had told herself, through all of this, that her mother understood. Her mother was not a demanding person. Her mother had never once said, in any of the 18-minute calls, anything that could be directly interpreted as wanting more. Her mother had simply asked how things were going, and listened with what Vivienne had always assumed was the interested attention of a parent proud of her child, and asked if she was eating enough and sleeping enough, and said goodbye in a voice that held nothing Vivienne could have brought to anyone as evidence of something withheld. She had been, Vivienne now understood, at a very careful and maintained distance, which is not the same thing as being close, and is not the same thing as being absent, and is, in some ways, the worst possible thing to be, because it allows a person to believe, for a very long time, that they are doing enough. She picked up the next item from the box. It was a photograph she recognized. She recognized it because she was in it. She was 23, standing in a navy dress outside the building where she had interviewed for her first real design position, the one that had changed everything. The interview that had been 15 minutes long, and that she had walked out of already knowing she had the job, because the interviewer had looked at her portfolio and said quietly, with the expression of someone seeing something they hadn't expected to see, "Where did you learn to do this?" She had not known the answer then. She had said something about natural affinity and the influence of travel, which was true, and about the design program she had attended, which was also true, but which she had always felt was insufficient as an explanation for the specific quality of her eye, the thing she had that the other candidates apparently didn't have, the thing the interviewer was looking at when they asked that particular question. On the back of the photograph, in her mother's handwriting, Viv's interview, April 1999, she looked. The box was a receipt. A receipt from a dry cleaner's in the city where Vivienne had done the interview. A receipt for the cleaning and pressing of one navy wool dress, one cotton blouse, and one pair of dress trousers, paid by credit card on the 14th of April 1999. The name on the receipt was not Vivienne's, it was Petra's. Vivienne stared at the receipt for a long time. She remembered the dress. She remembered being 23, and broke, and having exactly one interview-appropriate outfit, and being terrified. The morning of the interview, that it was not good enough, and then arriving at the interview and feeling, she had thought, simply confident, felt as though the clothes were right, felt as though she looked like the version of herself she was trying to be. She had attributed this to herself. She had told the story, in the years since, as a story about her own composure, her own readiness. Her mother had driven 2 hours the night before, collected the dress and the blouse and the trousers, had them cleaned and pressed overnight at a dry cleaner's in the city, and returned them. Vivienne tried to remember when she had woken up that morning, tried to remember whether the clothes had been there, and they had been hanging on the back of the door when she got up, and she had assumed she had done this herself and forgotten about it in the anxiety of the week, and driven home, and said nothing. Not then, not ever. Not in any of the 18-minute calls that had followed, not in any of the 17 visits, not in the 30 years between that April morning and the Tuesday 3 weeks ago when Petra Ashford had died quietly of a cardiac event in the back room of her shop at the age of 71, between the machine she had sat at every day for 30 years and the window that looked out onto the street she had chosen, when Vivienne was 12, to build a life on. She drove up the night before, Vivienne said. It wasn't a question. I wasn't here then, Ruth said. But she told me about it once. You'd called the week before and said you had an interview and you were worried your interview clothes weren't right. And then she said you stopped talking about it and she could tell you were trying not to need help. So she drove up the night before without telling you. Ruth paused. She said, you wore that dress like you owned the room. Those were the words she used. Vivienne pressed 2 fingers briefly to her mouth, which was a gesture she had not made in front of another person since she was approximately 20 years old, when she had learned that gestures like that cost more in a professional context than they were worth. and had stopped allowing herself them. Ruth did not comment on the gesture. She looked instead at the box, and then at the window, and then at the sign on the counter, and she let the silence stand because she understood, from 22 years of watching a woman who rarely said anything that didn't need to be said, that silence, in certain moments, was not an absence of something, but the presence of a thing too large for words to improve on. How many of these things did she do without telling anyone? Vivienne asked, when the silence had been what it needed to be. All of them, Ruth said simply. That was the whole point of how she did it. She used to say, not often, she wasn't a person who explained herself much, but she used to say that help given to be noticed isn't really help. It's a performance. She wasn't interested in performing. She looked at the box. She was interested in the thing actually getting done. Vivienne looked at the window. The shop was on a street that had been, when her mother opened it, not particularly prosperous, and had become, over 30 years, somewhat more so, without ever becoming the kind of street where a rent increase would have closed a business like this one. Her mother had been, Vivienne now understood, more deliberate about that particular detail of her location than she had ever let on. She called her husband that evening from the hotel room, and the conversation was longer than most of their recent conversations, which had tended toward the logistical since the planning for the estate began. I think I need more time here, she said. How much more? I don't know yet. A week, maybe more. There was a pause on the other end, not an irritated one, but the pause of a man recalibrating a calendar in his head and finding the math workable. What did you find? A box, Vivienne said, full of 30 years of small things. I haven't gotten through all of it yet. What kind of things? The kind, she said, that tell you exactly what a person thought was worth keeping. She went back to the shop the next morning, and the morning after that. She and Ruth went through the box together, sometimes with Ruth providing context, and sometimes in a silence that was entirely adequate to what was in front of them. And on the fourth morning, Vivienne sat down at the machine her mother had sat at every day for 30 years, and put her hands on the surface of it, and thought about a woman who had driven 2 hours to clean a dress without being asked, who had altered a school uniform 6 times, and refused to charge for a single one, who had sat in a housecoat in an emergency, and repaired a wedding veil in 55 minutes, and then kept a fragment of the lace in a box, so that the emergency and its resolution would be somewhere. On the 5th morning, she called the estate lawyer. I want to change the timeline, she said. The lease. I want to talk about whether there's a way to keep it running. The lawyer was a practical woman who had seen people make decisions about inherited properties at every stage of grief, and had learned not to express an opinion on the decision itself. Running how? She asked. You're based out of state. Ruth has been here 22 years, Vivienne said. She knows how to run it. I'd like to understand what it would mean to keep it open under her. The conversation that followed was practical in the way most useful conversations are practical, specific, about numbers and logistics and the precise difference between a lease extension and a transfer of management, about what it would require and what it would cost, and how long a sensible trial period might run. Vivienne took notes in the margins of the estate lawyer's intake form, using a pencil she had found in the cup on her mother's counter, and at the end of the conversation, she sat for a moment and looked at the front window, where the bracket had held the sign for most of 30 years, before Petra had moved it to the interior wall, and she thought about why a person moves a sign that has been in a window for decades to a wall where only the people behind the counter can see it. She thought perhaps her mother had reached a point where she no longer needed the words in the window because she already knew what they meant, where the practice had become so much a part of how she worked that the reminder was no longer for herself but for whoever came after. She called her husband again that evening, not about logistics this time, but in the way she had called him in the early years of their marriage, before the schedules had become what they were. The kind of call that doesn't have a clear purpose beyond wanting the other person on the other end of it. Tell me something, he said, when she had been quiet for a moment on the phone in the hotel room. I've been thinking about something she used to say, Vivienne said. Or rather, something I assumed she must have thought, because she never actually said it. I assumed she was proud of me the way parents are proud when a child does well, proud of the outcome, the visible evidence of success. And now I'm sitting here thinking that what she was actually proud of was the interview dress, the cleaned and pressed dress on the back of the door. The thing she did without telling me, that she kept in a box, that I attributed to myself for 23 years. Her husband was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do with that? I don't know yet, Vivienne said. I think I want to stay here long enough to find out. Ruth was in the back workroom when Vivienne walked through with the sign the next morning. She didn't say anything. she went to the window, found the bracket that had been left in the wood above the glass, still intact. It had been designed to be. The same care in the hardware as in the letters. And she replaced the sign in the bracket where it had apparently lived for most of 3 decades. She stepped back and looked at it. Every stitch is a promise. It was slightly crooked, the way it had probably always been slightly crooked, because whoever had installed the bracket had not used a level, or had used a level and then decided that slightly crooked was more honest than perfectly straight in a window that had never tried to be anything other than what it was. Ruth came out of the workroom and looked at the window and said nothing for a moment. "I want to be clear about something," Vivienne said. "I'm not keeping this open because I had some revelation about my purpose in life. I'm keeping it open because it should stay open. Because there are people who know this address and will come back to it, and they deserve to find something here that remembers why they came." She paused. "And because I need to know the rest of what's in the box. And I think I can only know it properly if I'm here." Ruth looked at her for a long moment with the particular regard of someone who has been doing careful, quiet work in the same place for 22 years and has learned to recognize the difference between a person who has understood a thing and a person who has decided they want to understand a thing and is willing to accept the second as a start. "There are 3 more items in the box," Ruth said. "I saved them for last. I'll make tea." Vivienne sat back down on the stool that fit the shape of the person who had occupied it every day for 30 years and waited, and when Ruth came back with the tea and set it on the counter and reached into the box for the last 3 things, Vivienne received each one with the full, unhurried attention of someone who has finally, in the particular way of people who arrive late to an understanding that was always available, decided to actually look. The third to last item was a button, a single button, ivory, carved, old, no note, no name, just the button, placed in a small paper envelope that had been sealed with tape rather than glue, the tape yellowed, and still holding. Ruth didn't know who had left it. She suspected it predated her by a decade at least. Petra had never explained it. She had simply kept it in the box, alongside everything that had a story, and everything that didn't, because some things didn't need explaining to deserve keeping. Vivienne turned the button over in her fingers and thought about 30 years of an address on a street that had been, when the shop opened, not particularly prosperous, and about the specific quality of patience required to sit at a machine every day for 30 years and make the promise implicit in every stitch, "I will do this correctly, I will do it well. The thing you bring to me will leave better than it came, and I will not make you feel the weight of needing me to do it." And she thought the button was a reasonable enough thing to hold while thinking about all of that. She placed it back in the envelope, and placed the envelope back in the box. The second to last item was a letter, in an envelope addressed simply to Petra, the handwriting confident and clear, postmarked 11 years earlier. Inside was a single page from a man named Thomas, who had been, according to the letter, the father of a girl named Isabel, the name on the wedding veil card, who had married on a March morning in 2003, an hour after a veil ripped, in a dress that had been worn by the same woman who repaired it, because that was the kind of morning it had been. Thomas wrote that he wanted her to know his daughter was well, that she had 2 children, that the marriage had been exactly as happy as it had looked on that chaotic morning, and that his wife, before she died the previous spring, had asked him to write to the woman who had fixed the veil, because she had always meant to thank her properly, and had always found a reason to wait. He ended with a line that Vivienne read twice, the way she had read the note in the first envelope on the first day. She said, "Your shop was the last place she felt taken care of before things got complicated, and she wanted you to know that the stitch held." The last item in the box was not an object someone else had left. It was a photograph Vivienne had never seen. Her mother, young, mid-30s, which would have made it approximately when Vivienne was 12, the year her mother had chosen the street to build a life on, standing at the machine in this room, in a light that had come through the window, at a particular angle that no longer existed in quite that way, because the building across the street had been extended upward by 2 floors at some point in the 90s. Her mother was not looking at the camera. She was looking at her work. She had the expression of someone doing something they know how to do, which is the least performed expression a person can have, the expression of someone in the absence of an audience. On the back, in handwriting Vivienne didn't recognize, Petra at work. She didn't know I took it. Ruth didn't know who had taken it. Someone who had come in for an alteration and had a camera, which was a different thing in the mid-80s than it became later. Someone who had watched Vivienne's mother work and decided, for whatever reason, that the watching deserved recording. Vivienne sat for a long time with that photograph. She thought about the sign in the window, visible from the street, in the particular light of late afternoon. She thought about the box, and what it contained, and what it did not contain, and the difference between those two things. She thought about her mother's hands on the machine in the photograph, doing something they knew how to do, in a room they had not yet spent 30 years in, with the whole thing still ahead. She thought about the dress. The navy wool dress, cleaned and pressed overnight, hanging on the back of a door at 6 in the morning, making her feel, in the way that only well-maintained clothes and composed spaces can make a person feel, like the version of herself she needed to be for the next 4 hours. She had worn it like she owned the room. That was what her mother had said. Those were the words she had used. She placed the photograph back in the box, with the button and the letter and the wedding veil card, and the school uniform receipt and everything else that had accumulated in 30 years of quiet, particular attention to the small emergencies and large occasions of other people's lives. And she closed the lid. And she put the box on the shelf below the counter, where it had apparently lived for most of her mother's working life, and she left it there. The sign stayed in the window. The shop is still open. If there is someone in your life who has done quiet things, things you found out about later, or maybe haven't found out about yet, leave a comment for them. They don't have to read it. The leaving of it is the point. We'll read every one.